Globalization, once again, but the year 10 version as opposed to the year 9 version. So we really use this lesson at the start of it just to go over a bit of old ground. Classification of jobs. Okay, remember there are 4 main ways that we can classify employment types, and they are, of course, primary, secondary, tertiary, quaternary. Primary, taking things from nature or from the land, examples being miners, farmers. Secondary jobs, making or processing things. Most secondary jobs are done in a factory. Tertiary jobs, providing a service for people. Teacher, working in a shop. A doctor, a lawyer, a train driver. Quaternary sector, high-tech research and design. Usually a job that you need some very specialised qualifications for. Now, the percent of people that do each of these jobs in a country has a particular name, the employment structure. Right? So, in terms of the UK, the employment structure is right there. 80% of people doing tertiary jobs, 17% in secondary, 2% in primary, and 1% in quaternary. But the key thing is that the employment structure in Britain hasn't always been like that. It changes over time, and it changes from, so for instance this graphic here, from 1978 it's changed very slightly. Tertiary is increased from 60 to around about where it is now, 80%. Secondary has decreased from about 34 down to around about 20% there. But it's not just over the last 30 years or so that it's changed. If we go back even further, if this wants to work, there we go. If we go back even further, 200 years, you can see that the amount of people working in primary, secondary and tertiary, the employment structure, has changed a lot more drastically. Now, so 200 years ago, 70% of people worked in primary jobs, just 10% of people in tertiary jobs. But this has changed. Now, this model here, this graph here, has a particular name. We could replace these labels here, particularly these two here, pre-industrial and post-industrial, with some terms that we've come up with and we've used an awful lot in geography. Here we could say LEDCs, here we can say MEDCs. Poor countries, lots of people in primary, less people in tertiary. MEDCs, the opposite, lots in tertiary, hardly any in primary. And then you've got this middle ground here, industrial. So a country is developing, it's industrializing. It's what we call an NIC, a newly industrialized country. And these are countries where the tertiary is on the rise, primary is on the fall, and manufacturing is hitting a peak. Secondary is hitting a peak before it starts to drop off a little bit. Now, the key thing here is that employment structure changes over time, but it also changes spatially as well. Depends on where you are in the world. Be you a rich country, be you a poor country, your employment structure is going to reflect that. So we did this very quick exercise here on the Clark-Fisher model. So important that you remember the Clark-Fisher model and that you can identify it in an exam so that you can talk about it. It often gets confused with the demographic transition model, so make sure that you've got copies of each of those and you can pinpoint the differences between the two, because they both talk about completely different things. This talks about employment, the other one talks about population growth. So, simple little exercise here. The post-industrial countries, the MEDCs, Norway, the UK, and just about, even though it's had its issues of late, Greece, and the newly industrialised countries, Brazil, and Chile here, and then all the rest, pre-industrial, LEDCs. So make sure that you can talk about the key points of the Clark-Fisher model in an exam. And Key thing is about the Clark-Fisher model is that some people would argue that it's not actually particularly reliable because it doesn't take all things into account. For instance, war, disease, environmental issues can all make an effect on a country's employment structure. So it's not always just as simple as saying, oh well, loads of people in primary, you must be poor. Okay, it's a lot more complicated than that, so make sure that you're aware of those key points.